the Supreme Court. Let's bring in today's Economic Roundtable. Thomas Woods is a senior fellow at the Von Mises Institute and author of the wonderful bestseller Meltdown. Shikha Dalmia is a senior policy analyst at Reason Foundation, a free market think tank, and David Buckner is professor of organizational leadership at Columbia University and here with me in the studio. Tom, to you first. Are you surprised that the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, from the bench, without even writing a decision, upheld this bankruptcy judge, which the effect of which was to take money away from bondholders and turn the law of the land on its head?
Well, I don't see how anybody can be surprised by anything in 2009 America. It's an arbitrary regime that rewrites laws in its own favor. I mean, here you have senior creditors being deprived of what is obviously theirs. And the bogus argument, if you can even call it that they've tried to use is that Chrysler was getting TARP money. And so that changes everything. You know, if you were accepting interest on these assets, and the company in question was getting TARP money, well, you know, hey, you have to take the good with the bad. So in other words, these pension funds were supposed to turn down these interest payments and say, no, we don't want these interest payments because the company's getting TARP money. The whole thing is insane, but it's just a day in the life of modern America.
David, what happens when someone with a lot of money to invest, like the treasurer of a state, a couple $100 million, goes to an investment counselor and they say, well, the safest investments are bonds, and then something like this happens?
This is a hijacking. I mean, as you see this, the law states that as I loan you money, you will pay me back in an agreeable time period.
Right.
And the hijacking of this now creates unpredictability. That's why they've taken it to the courts. The challenge with this down the line is the larger economic impact. Now, why would I ever lend you money again?
Right.
And why would I ever give my pension funds to somebody who's going to lend it to somebody where the government can come in and hijack it? That's the problem with it.
Shikha, should we be concerned about the loss of freedom, about the idea that the White House can come in and dictate terms to private litigants, and life-tenured federal judges will just supinely accept the dictation of those terms?
I think we absolutely should be judged. You know, the Obama administration has essentially shredded the Constitution, and it ought to send it to a landfill at this stage. You know, I completely agree with your other two guests. You know, there is a clear hierarchy in bankruptcy law. And what's interesting is that the administration has overturned this hierarchy where the secured lenders have to be paid first and the unsecured lenders, which is what essentially the UAW is, has to be paid last. It has subverted this hierarchy, not for the good of the company, but as a political payoff to a political constituency. It doesn't get any worse than that. And I know Mr. Wood said that, you know, in America in 2009, nothing is surprising. But I have to tell you, I'm pretty damn surprised here.
Tom, in 1970, when the government took over AMTRAK, President Nixon said, don't worry about it. It'll run a deficit for about 3 years. And after that, it'll make a lot of money, so much so that investors will be clamoring to buy it. Well, here we are, 40 years later. The government owns AMTRAK. It has lost billions. It loses hundreds of millions a year. The government will own some of Chrysler. The government will own 60% of General Motors if the bankruptcy court and the Second Circuit do the same thing with General Motors. Is there even the remotest chance that 40 years from now the government won't still own it?
Well, the only way that would be is if the economy melted down so much that it came down to, you know, am I going to get the few scraps remaining of Social Security payments, or are we going to keep this crummy car company? That'll be it. But otherwise, it seems to me that the real question is, what's the exit strategy? I mean, if you're going to have 60% of GM, and then eventually the idea is you're going to get rid of it, who's going to buy it? Right. The government's going to keep driving it into the ground, and the government, you know, you mentioned AMTRAK, Judge. I mean, the L.A. to Orlando route loses about $450 a passenger. We might as well just buy them plane tickets and forget the whole thing. GM is losing somewhere on the order of $3,000 to $4,000 a unit. Well, I mean, that's right up the government's alley. They'll just make it worse, and then they're going to try and sell it to whom? Who would buy it?
Shikha, is there anybody in the government who stands up for the Constitution anymore? I mean, is it just big government version Republican style and big government version Democratic style?
I think that's what you are seeing right now. You know, Just to go back to the AMTRAK analogy, actually I saw another great analogy made by Bob Elton, who's an automobile historian, and he said that, GM is going to be Obama's Vietnam, which essentially means that this is an unwinnable war. Every time he turns his head, another $20 billion are going to go. And let me just point out one more thing. It's actually going to be much worse than AMTRAK, because AMTRAK has so far only taken $30 billion from taxpayers, whereas GM, the opening bid is $50 billion plus. So, and where does the government get this money? It gets this money by, overriding our economic liberties.
Professor,
it takes from one and gives to the other. And so I think Bush opened the door to this kind of, these kinds of shenanigans.
And the floodgates have come.
Obama has... Yes, and Obama has driven a truck through it.
General Motors, thank you, Shikha. If General Motors loses money on every car it makes, isn't it literally and mathematically impossible for them to make enough profit to pay the government back?
It's impossible, but what's interesting here is if the government owns it, the taxpayers back end it. That means if it goes down, we pay for it. If it goes up, who keeps the cash?
Well,
the government. And that's for expansion. That's for government expansion. So when you look at the constitutional issues of this overreach, the problem is what is the end strategy or the end game?
Shikha Dalmia, Dave Brucker, Tom Woods, thanks very much.
Good to be with you.
Remember Sotomayor's comment about a wise Latina woman would be a better judge than a white male? Well, it turns out it wasn't an isolated incident or just a poor choice of words. What kind of justice would she make? Next.